Today I'm presenting the chapter "Is God a Mathematician? The Meaning of Metabolism," in which Jonas asks, actually investigates the following quote that I have written here. From the intrinsic evidence of his creation, the great architect of the universe now begins to appear as a pure mathematician. And he's gonna approach this question in two ways, with this proposition with two questions. The first is going to be a historical question of what does this quote actually say? What does he have in mind what does the quote have in mind when it invokes the great architect and as it invokes the concept of pure mathematics? And this is going to be a historical question investigating so the difference between an ancient and modern mathematics, between so Greek experience of nature and then Judeo-Christian experience of nature and so on. And the question, the second question that he wants to answer is this proposition, this quote, true? And he's going to try to answer this question with respect to the living organisms, as he's going to investigate whether it is possible to understand living organisms as merely mathematical creations or constructions created by this mathematical God, the great architect of the universe. So he says that, in other words, if life is not within the competence of an alleged cosmic principle, that the principle expressed in the quote above, though it is in every sense within the cosmos, then that principle is inadequate for the cosmos as well. If this should result in a reductio ad absurdum, the impossible concept has still, though it's through its self-defeat, served a useful purpose. So basically, he's gonna provide a big reductio ad absurdum argument. So trying to basically negate negate his conclusion that only life can know life, by invoking the great mathematical God, and then show that actually this God is, in a sense, impossible if you want to say that life really is a given fact in the world. Okay, so if we go to the first juxtaposition, so Jonas analyzes the differences between Greek and modern mathematics. Perhaps the best example is the distinction between classical geometry and modern algebra, or actually analytical geometry. And basically the difference boils down to classical Greek mathematics and geometry being of a more intuitive nature, whereas modern algebra and analytic geometry and modern mathematics more broadly are symbolic creations in a much more pronounced manner. So to give an example, an ellipse, of course, is a conic section. I never quite understood why it always gets introduced like that, but actually Greek geometry constructed ellipses out by so cutting a cone in half, and then cutting a cone in half, you get an ellipse, and that's how you construct it. Whereas in modern mathematics, of course, we have the equation of an ellipse, which was introduced by Descartes, where you can abstractly kind of describe the ellipse without intuitively constructing it as a conic section. And then, of course, you can even give it to a computer to plot a graph of it. And so completely divorce the meaning of a mathematical concept from its construction, intuitive construction, everyday construction, you could say. So, of course, this also influenced, to a large extent, modern physics, as it started to think about nature in a more symbolic manner. Jonas says that actually the main object of measurement of interest was spatiotemporal motions. That means that actually time became a really important variable, independent variable, in mathematical descriptions of physical laws. So that basically you don't investigate patterns, but you investigate processes, as he says. So he says that substantial forms that kind of reigned in classical physics, mathematics, and geometry were replaced by elementary motions and forces. So what does this mean? Basically, if we take an example of orbits of planets, so Greek physics, in a broad manner, excuse the generalization, please. But one could say that the orbits of the planets were subservient to the form of the circle. So the circle was the most perfect geometrical form, and that's why the part of the world that was completely overflown in ether chose or was expressed by kind of the orbits of the planet taking circular motions. So the form is, in a sense, more important than the elementary movements of each successive moment. Whereas modern approach, of course, decomposes this general motion of the orbit of a planet into gravity and inertia. So basically, you says that one can say that gravity changes the direction of the movement of a particle of a planet just in such a way that it starts to oscillate on a predictable orbit. So that it creates a oscillation pattern, which is not something that transcends substance, but actually comes out from the simplest material constituents of the pattern. So he says quite nicely that, in a word, then, for the modern idea of understanding nature, the least intelligent has become the most intelligible, the least reasonable, the most rational. So if a circle is, we understand circle as a circle in this intuitive way that I was describing above. So it seems that for ancient Greeks, it was enough just to say that an orbit of a planet is a circle. Whereas for modern thought, this seems kind of an irrational explanation, giving nature a little bit, so more than it deserves, more intelligence that it deserves. So basically, you try to find the least reasonable elements or factors of a specific process, and then supposedly you understand this process much better than if you just described it with a general form. Of course, this was an analytic way of approaching the problem, but he also investigates the difference between Greek and Judeo-Christian understanding of nature, which is even a more historical approach to the problem. So basically, he tries to see how this change in mathematics and physics and science more broadly was possible, and he finds this in the way religion interpreted, or maybe this general Weltanschauung, which is tied to religion, how it influenced our relationship with nature. So he starts with Plato's Timaeus, and says that actually for Plato, intelligible was everything that was kind of intelligent. That means that the world was intelligible, was meaningful, because there was an intelligent soul that was kind of sustaining all the meaningful patterns arising. So, for example, the orbits of the planets. So soul pervades the cosmos in degrees of divinity, that is, of intelligence. The more consistently rational emotion, the higher must be the intelligence of the moving soul. So, as we'll see, this complexity is a result of something making it complex, in contrast to the modern approach, which would say that merely the interaction between the most basic particles is a little bit more complex. And that's bottom up. Of course, he says that Jewish monotheism, on the other hand, abolishes natural deities and thus separates God from his creation. And then Christianity, of course, separates also human soul from the material world. So what we have here is a split between, which we'll see afterwards that Descartes used, between the res cogitans and res the extended matter. So this bond between intelligible and intelligent is severed, and actually God and soul are separated from blind, mindless nature. So God creates a nature in a way so that this nature can self-propagate without his kind of influence. So a question then arises also, why was it possible that Christianity could exclude the soul from nature? And it was possible because it wasn't needed as a cause for movement. And by doing that, actually, creation was equated. So the creation as a whole, every part of the creation of the world was equal before God, which is nothing less than an idea of universal mechanics, so that there's a universal physics that holds for the whole world, not just parts of it. So since, for example, in ancient Greek physics, once again, you had kind of so the heavens, which operated with their own laws, and the worldly part of the world, which operated with its own laws. And of course, motion, as we said, is a really important plays an important part in this new science of nature, is a self-serving endowment of creation, self-conserving endowment of creation. So if I just give an example, Galileo at some point says that he's in agreement with Plato. Of course, nobody really knows where Plato said that, but basically Galileo was convinced that at the beginning of the universe, of the solar system, God took planets and actually threw them around the sun so that they kind of started circling the sun, going around the orbits in an oscillatory manner. But it wasn't like we described with Plato, that there was a certain intelligence conserving this motion, the form that was making the motion possible, but actually it was God who merely kind of started the process. The process was afterwards moving by itself. As I said, Descartes followed the Judeo-Christian tradition in separating everything that exists into res cogitans and res extensa. By that, he separated the intrinsically linked notions of form and matter, which were important for ancient thought, into the distinction between subject and object, mind and nature, etc. And of course, nature, as already stated, becomes matter, self-sufficiently existing by itself. And thus we have reached from the metaphysical and the same result to which we were previously led by the analysis of method, namely that the least intelligent has become the most, nay, the only intelligible. So first he compared ancient Greek mathematics and science to their modern equivalents, discovered this kind of principle or distinction, and then he also did it from a more broad vantage point. But now, of course, life is still a material fact of nature, and he's gonna investigate what does this actually mean for the mechanical outlook that's implied by the quote from the beginning. So the question is both, is God a pure mathematician? So we have to actually ask about God's mathematical perception. So we have to ask how God would view living beings if he saw them. How would he see them? And one can say that organisms in some sense are nothing else than simple aggregates of matter. So a void mostly crisscrossed by the geometry of forces that emanate from the insular foci of localized elementary being. However, with organisms, something else arises, and that is metabolism, the exchange of matter with surroundings. So if I take a rock, it obviously isn't performing a metabolic pattern, metabolic function, because it's in a sense static. Whereas organisms seem at first glance could be interpreted as aggregates, but actually this metabolism kind of makes this interpretation not adequate. Because material identity is not an identity, the identity of a living form. Because it is never the same materially, and yet persists as its same self by not remaining the same matter. I think that a good example here could be the ship of Theseus, where a question of how many parts I can replace and does the ship still stay the same kind of intuitively makes sense, even if it's hard to answer it. Whereas if I ask, am I still the same person if I after 5 lunches and if I go to the toilet, that seems like of a question of a different kind. So is God a pure mathematician? Because even if we grant this distinction between material identity and the identity of a living form, it's still possible to describe to a certain extent the mathematical oscillation or structure of this metabolic pattern. And of course, Jonas says that, for example, a wave would be a very simple way of describing an oscillatory motion. And then, of course, one could see that this transcending form that we can describe, for example, cybernetics tries to describe this, is of a different order from that of a crystal structure. Because in a crystal structure, the form is inseparably allied to the persistence of the material. So it seems that he's searching for a way to mathematically describe this constant change of material substance. And this mathematical description could completely account for any and all changes in materiality. And of course, if infinite intelligence could possess perfect knowledge of this form of this living being, I mean, it can possess this perfect knowledge if their existence is completely encapsulated in the mathematical description. So infinite intelligence kind of could describe the cybernetic view of life. However, this being of life, the way it would see life would be a formal abstract add-on on the interactions between most basic parts of the universe. And as a consequence, in the mathematical mechanical world picture, the identity of the living being would be phenomenal, would be fictitious, would be something that would be an illusion, one could say. It wouldn't be a real, the living beings wouldn't really exist. They would just appear to exist. But actually, Jonas says, yeah, this kind of misses the point. And it misses the mathematical God misses the point because he's divorced from the world. And this identity is for him only a fictitious appearance. And this is not really a good outlook on life, because the identity of living beings is sustained for its own sake. So there is something in the form that tries to define itself against the perturbations, against the outside influences that could kind of dissipate here. For example, if one takes a hammer to a rock, the rock won't be able to resist. Whereas that wouldn't really work for animal. So life presents the ontological individual and transcends the merely phenomenological fictitious one. Okay, so life, a living being, is an ontological fact. And this fact possesses a double nature. So materials are, of course, essential to it specifically in a specific moment. It cannot exist outside of the material world, yet they seem to be accidental individually. So in sense, they're not the specific material is not part of the form that a living being is supposed to kind of sustain. In a word, the organic form stands in a dialectical relation to needful freedom to matter. And this is very important now because freedom is a central concept. And so it basically follows from the fact that life is of course a dialectical relationship between matter and form. But in a sense, form presides over matter by making organism independent from matter to a certain extent. So it enables it to exchange matter with its surroundings. And of course, this is, as we've already mentioned, metabolism. And of course, there is no really internal principle of physical identity. So every physical identity could be said to be accidental. There is nothing in a rock that makes it wanna exist in that way. Or in another way, we could say that it's very, very easy in most cases to kind of destroy that identity into smaller parts. But organic metabolic identity is actually an internal identity. And that's why Jonas insists that only life can know life. Because a hypothetical pure mathematician would not be able to perceive life, since only living beings are able to recognize life and living beings. And we're, of course, prepared by this, that we are living beings. And this internal identity that we sustain is actually the starting point for understanding any other internal identity of other forms of life that we encounter. And by interpolating this internal identity with other living beings, we are able to perceive life. But because pure mathematical God is not a embodied living being, he does not possess this identity and cannot interpolate it with other living beings. So, as I've already said, there is the dialectical nature of organic freedom. Metabolism, on the one hand, enables the living beings to maintain a form independently of material changes. However, it also requires the living being to change its material. So Jonas expresses this really nicely. He says that the organism's liberty is its peculiar necessity. And of course, the organism needs the world to exchange it with the matter out of which the organism and the world are composed. And this world comprises the first spatial transcendence that an organism can take towards the self and towards the world. This transcendence comes from the need to sustain the form that the organism was given and that it enacts. However, there's also a inward subjective horizon, the temporal horizon, which arises out of the self-reflection of the organism on itself. It's a kind of inner immanence, the immanence of that future into which organic continuity is each moment about to extend by the satisfaction of that moment's want. So on the one hand, I can of course I can be hungry, and I can go to a grocery store and buy some food. But this is the spatial external horizon that the world presents me, this possibility of getting food, but the possibility of feeling hungry, of thinking about, oh, I should go into the near future. In the near future, I should go and get some food. That's the temporal horizon that arises out of my pre-reflective reflection upon my kind of my state and my change of state. Of course, out of this, we can also, we can recognize biological time and space in these two horizons, where biological time is the internal direction towards the next impending phase of a being that has to continue itself, and biological space is the external direction towards the co-present not itself, which holds the stuff relevant for its continuation, that is the world, which kind of houses the potential solutions to my needs. Of course, life therefore transcends itself, and Jonas says that it enters a horizon or horizons beyond its point identity. So we can see that this ability to interact with horizons comes from this dialectical nature of the metabolic pattern of the organic freedom. So to conclude, or to answer the question, if the primary proposition that the world is created by a mathematical God, is this proposition true? Jonas says that no, a mathematical God would not be able to recognize itself. Sorry, not itself, life. Life itself would not even become visible, not yet a blank in its place. So basically, it would appear only as a complex process of most elementary particles. There would not be life wouldn't be an essentially new feature. So the distinction between, for example, non-living and living matter, or identities, would be a completely arbitrary distinction for him. He wouldn't see why this is really so important, for example, for us. And of course, Jonas also said that Descartes, in a sense, tried to solve this by adding a subjective dimension, but he did it a little bit too ad hoc, because if we go the way Descartes wanted us to go, then there exists a radical split between res cogitans and res extensa, since there doesn't seem to be anything that connects them in the way that we experience their connection in everyday life or in a biological reality. That is to say that there exists a connection between objective processes, eyes, ears, and we can find equivalents of this in many life forms, and actually subjective experiences, so seeing and hearing. So if a biologist discovers that certain microbes react to light, he's gonna pretty soon start speaking about, oh yeah, there's a kind of seeing happening here. He's not gonna describe it in a behavioristic way of just they simply react as a feather reacts when I blow on it. So to conclude, at all events, the teleological structure and behavior or organism is not just an alternative choice of description. It is, on the evidence of each one's own organic awareness, the external manifestation of the inwardness of substance. To add the implications, there is no organism without teleology. There is no teleology without inwardness. And life can be known only by life. So is God a mathematician? Probably not. So this is it. Thank you for listening. Unfortunately, I was hoping this would be a bit faster, but I have to run. I have a concert. So see you.
Okay, Izak, thank you. Be well. Okay, so let's start a discussion. Who would like to start? Please go ahead. I'm going to intentionally be silent this time, even if it's awkward. I don't care. Otherwise, I'll start talking again, and I don't want to do that.
Okay, maybe I'll just get the ball rolling. I mean, here, yeah,
Go on. No.
yeah. I mean,
Yes, you didn't hear me before, right?
No.
no,
Yeah, okay. Just go on, Adnan. I'll go after you.
okay. Well, I was just going to say that here, this is kind of where it really, where he starts becoming more explicit, because throughout the previous our previous meetings, we've always been sort of, talking about what does this imply, how far does this have to go, and here I think it's in a way it's like a mic drop moment. No organism without teleology, no teleology without inwardness, and life can be known only by life. I think those words are really, they really echo quite a while after reading them. So my sort of way to get the ball rolling in the discussion would be to ask whether, anyone else had a different impression, etc. But Timothy, whether it's that or something else, go ahead. You are more than welcome.
Yeah, no, I mean, my question is quite vague and pertains to his, I mean, I had issues with his notion of matter. And it seems to me that this notion is like the cornerstone of all his arguments that he makes here. But, and generally understanding what precisely would, like, why does should matter not be understood as exhibiting some sort of forms or patterns or organization, let's say? Like, what exactly is missing? I mean, I can understand this in the sense that maybe he supposes a very kind of naive concept of matter where you have like fundamental, like a corpuscular understanding, right? Where you have particles interacting with local rules of like bumping into each other, but we know that this isn't really, I mean, in his time, this was like a very established thing, that this was not a kind of worldview that fundamental physics was teaching. So you can think of like already in electromechanics, in yeah. So and later, of course, you have like later developments with Einstein and stuff like that. Like what I'm forgetting the word for like the second great revolution in 20th century. Jesus, what's the word?
Relativity.
Quantum mechanics. Yeah, right. So the notion of matter here, like, was really kind of like, I couldn't really agree with most of his steps in the argument because the notion of matter was so strange to me, so outdated, since to me at least. So yeah, maybe if anybody has any comments on that.
Well, I would just have a factual comment in the sense of, I think it's very explicit in the sense of that he's not buying into the corpuscular conception of matter. For example, on page 77, he says very clear that in the contemporary physics, you have now dynamic wholes, and that these behave in a very specific sense, and that modern physics deals largely with such whole structures of happening, and special mathematical techniques are employed in their description. Here then form re-enters the physical scene with a cognitive science significance of its own, and this transcending form, an event structure, as he calls it, is of a different order from the crystal structure. So his point would be that physics is fully well aware of these types of dynamic forms, but according to him, even though you have these physical forms are not enough to account for the vital forms. So I don't know. The question that you're kind of bringing up is a pertinent one, but I think that his main point would be that once you reintroduce the notion of form, and if this form exhibits qualitatively different features, you will have to decide what you're going to do. Either you're going to say there is no form. Form is ultimately something that is derivable from something that is more elementary, or you're going to say, I take form seriously, and this form exhibits characteristics that are qualitatively different. Hence, I cannot explain them in the same way as the other ones. So once you introduce the notion of form, you have an epistemological and also ontological issue, I think. You have to do something with them. So, you have physical form and you have matter, and they don't seem, according to Jonas, to exhibit the same types of features.
Yeah. So I was having trouble understanding like what precisely is missing from his understanding of physical forms. Like, yeah, and I recall the argument that was like kind of, so whereas physical forms are like constituted out of individual elements, individual particles, and the form is a kind of a top-down description of some sort of it's not really, I mean, the particles don't exist for the whole or something, like they're not determined by this larger whole that they constitute, whereas with the organism it seems so, right? So, but I mean, I was thinking like on that, I remembered like Gestalt psychologists try to make like bridge this gap precisely on level of different kind of forms that one encounters in the physical world. And I think that the notion like of let's say an electromagnetic field that the Gestalt psychology introduces is a good example where like there is some sort of a holistic pattern determining the behavior of the individual constituent parts, right? And on this level, I would say I have issues with Jonas's like sharp distinction between physical and biological types of forms, maybe.
But my response to this would be basically the same one that Merleau-Ponty provides in the structure of behavior. And so as not to just name drop, I would say the following. So again, once you take the notion of form seriously, the main criticism in the structure of behavior of Gestalt psychology and Gestalt approaches to having forms and then just saying, well, you find form in the physical world, you find forms in the biological world, and then you find forms in the mental or experiential world. And now we have some sort of an isomorphism. And then the move that they make, and this is what Merleau-Ponty finds problematic, is say, well, we will just take the physical form as the ultimate one. And according to Merleau-Ponty, you cannot do this once you've really accepted that your ontology is a form ontology. Because then, if you have different types of forms, you have to take this in face value. And you cannot simply say, well, this is the most fundamental one. So the argument from matter no longer plays the crucial role. And I would say that with Jonas, what this differentiates vital, that is to say, organic whole from the physical whole of different types, is that the form becomes an end unto itself. So this is something that you don't seem to find exhibited, at least in this particular manner. Of course, maybe for a short period of time or something, yes, but in a way where you really have this as a determining feature of a certain form, which truly tries to engage with external factors in a way where it tries to always integrate them in a fashion that would be conducive to its own development, maintenance in a dynamic sense, this would be something that would be crucial. And this is what basically Jonas means by teleology, I think. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think that's a pretty thorough answer. You can hear me? Yes. Yeah, the thought that came up with me when reading it was that the definition that life is this relative independence of form over matter isn't enough. But I think with what you add to it, that there should be this teleological dimension of self-sustaining, maybe that completes the picture a bit. Because I was thinking of, for example, a whirlwind, or a whirlwind in the ocean. There's also a sort of relative independence of form over matter there, like the particles of water keep changing, but the spiral remains. But the whirlwind doesn't try to keep itself going. So would that be the extra element needed to kind of complete the definition of life in this context?
I guess that this is what Jonas is kind of going at, and I think that that's the main reason why he's trying. So one of the things that makes Jonasian approach somewhat unique if you compare it to other approaches of similar nature. For example, when we were covering Plessner on Merleau-Ponty or stuff like that, he really does. He puts a lot of weight on teleology. So teleology really means a lot to him, and I think that the main reason is precisely for this. He has this Heideggerian notion of concern. Yeah, so really this idea of the form trying to self-maintain in a dynamical fashion, which probably includes also the idea of development, so not just remaining static, but remaining the same through all the changes that it undergoes. And I think that this is the crux around which he's then trying to build his argument, because if you think about it, and I would really be interested in hearing your thoughts on this. How would you spell out the argument, like concisely, for this idea that life can be only known by life? I think that the main thing that he's trying to kind of give across is this idea that it is through your lived teleological structure and everything that it entails that you can recognize it in the forms. I think that ultimately with Jonas it boils down to this, and then it's just about fleshing out what this means. So I don't know. It's an interesting picture. I always, when I read him, some of the things that he fleshes out and the way he does it is just incredible, because in one chapter he does so much with really fleshing out the philosophy, the dialectical philosophy of living. But at the same time, I don't know, there's something about his sliding towards the inwardness and sliding towards teleology that's always slightly off-putting to me. It's like, he qualifies it hard. So it's really difficult. I think that some critics are being unfair to him. They see inwardness and subjectivity and ego and self, and they just say, yeah, this is like, it's kind of metaphysically naive, and they bash him from the very beginning. I'm trying to be charitable when I approach him, but there's still something like this. When I was talking to Timothy about Plessner, Timothy told me there was always something off with Plessner for him. For me, there's always something slightly off with Jonas. I really like the way he writes. He's a marvelous stylist. I like the way he kind of flashes out things, but there's just something slightly off for me with him. So I don't know. I would be interested to hear other people's views and opinions on this, or impressions.
Can I just add something? Like, this relates to like your previous response and what you said right now about life only being able to be known by life. So my response to your like qualifications, like of different levels of forms, and like, of course, also, I wasn't trying to say that you could reduce every type of form or the living form to like any isomorphism with like with any kind of electromagnetic fields processes or anything like that, but just like that was just Jonas's argument from like relationship of parts with wholes. But then there's another argument pertaining to this sort of adaptive self-maintenance, sort of self-interest going on here. And in here, I would say, okay, maybe to take this counter argument somewhat further, let's introduce like self-regulatory mechanisms or adaptive self-regulatory, let's say a robot or something. Like why wouldn't that be something that possessing an interior? If you specify it in the sense that it has some capability of regulating internal states and even regulating its interactions with the environment with reference to those internal states, let's say. So what would be missing here? And to connect this to your question, I think precisely what Jonas is trying to do is somehow differentiate life from such mechanisms, from mechanisms that seem to be a sort of mimesis of life, but not quite living, right? And he's trying to say, okay, you can have a mathematical God, he can understand like such mechanisms, but he cannot understand true interiority. So what precisely is that? What is, like, I'm also having trouble grasping, like, what is the true interiority here? Like, maybe you could specify it in a sort of like in affective terms or in terms of like your existential terms, but I don't know, like, why wouldn't you be able to ascribe existential and affective terms to such a robot? Like, this is my issue.
Would anyone like to go at it? Have a go at it?
Well, the first thing I think of is that the robot would still not be a fully autopoietic system, and that seems to be important for Jonas's definition of life. So it's not actually self-developing, self-organizing, self-reproducing. Maybe if it has all of that, it would count as life. But even then, from the initial phase would be constructed by us, and maybe life is still set apart on that level.
Yeah, so actually it has in a certain sense almost like an imprinted inwardness and in teleology by the life that knows what it means to be alive. But it doesn't build the conditions of possibility of its own organization, in the sense of where you would have, in that long footnote when he differentiates between machines and the living beings. I don't know which footnote it is. I forgot. But
13.
Yeah. Okay. So that one where he says that with the living being, the machines, what you have is they exist even when they are in a certain sense taken apart or kind of not operating. But with the living being, it is kind of, in order for it to be at all, it has to work. So the working of the living machine is not really self-producing in the sense of what it would truly self-produce. It already, in a certain sense, exists or pre-exists. So even if, for example, you create homeostat, yeah, or something like that, you would already have a certain something that consists of certain parts, and you would just try to find a way to model behavior, but you wouldn't really see the emergence of the behavior which self-regulates in its emergence. So the birth of the behavior you wouldn't see, because if this happened from the very beginning, this particular form would have to care for itself in a more fundamental way, where it would really have to be its own goal. So it would really have to take care of self-preserving, in the sense of engaging with the world in a way where it would truly constitute every part of itself. Yeah, so self-form. And you don't really get this in these particular machines. What you do get is these types of forms, which are living forms, being able, because they're able to recognize the living beings, according to Jonas, model similar forms that would do what they want them to do and what they would recognize as something akin to teleology in their own terms. But they would invest it, they would imprint it in a certain sense into that particular form. I'm not sure whether this is satisfying, but you know at least what I'm getting at with this. So maybe somebody else can add something and maybe articulate it even better, more precisely. Maybe.
This is, I think, really good as an answer, but I'm thinking about passivity of living beings. There is always some kind of passivity. And so much of what you were saying, I think, is applicable to living beings in general, because there is always, like, as I would say, passivity towards their surrounding. So they are also kind of imprinted by, you know, their parents, or, you know, the other living beings at which they kind of it's kind of parasitism, right? Or interanimality, we can say with Merleau-Ponty. So far I'm not convinced, because yeah, there is kind of dependency in living beings as well, and because it's never self maintenance, right? It's kind of inter maintenance, I would say. You know what? Does it make sense?
Yes,
Yeah, it makes sense.
I would just like to add, yes, that was also one of my concerns. Like, life itself is never truly autopoietic in this sense, right? It's not an infinitely self-reproducing form. It always has conditions where it breaks down as an autopoietic system, and it has, like, let's say, points of vulnerability to which it cannot respond adaptively. So any sort of argument which would like to differentiate between living and non-living goes in the way of, in the sense of, so okay, robots are not totally self-producing because they have some sort of, let's say, they need to be maintained, they need to be built up. But of course, also we have to, I mean, people are born, they're not self-made, right? They're brought up, they're like part of a larger system which is essential to their survival, right?
I think there's a network issue here. I don't know. I mean, judging by Sebastian's face, it's not just on my end. It was probably on your end, Timothy. So if you can, I think it's still persisting. This sort of the video is very choppy.
But I would definitely be eager to hear that argument.
You're also muted, Sebastian. I think you were speaking.
Yeah, so maybe we can wait a little bit so that Timothy's internet stabilizes, because I think it's still unstable given the video. So I don't know, maybe somebody else can
Well, maybe in the meanwhile, I'll just drop a comment, which the whole point of view that only life can know life. It reminded me also of Plessner's approach because I think at least most of you here have also read Plessner. It reminded me at least of the approach of starting with the perceptual intuition of the living being, and starting with the fact that we see a living being as having the form of being alive, and that we by ourselves invested with this sense of being living, and that's something we do by nature. And that's where Plessner points out these laws, right? These a priori material laws. So I get the feeling that Jonas probably is pointing at something similar, sort of a pre-reflective harmony between life and its environment, between life and other life, that makes it recognize the living. And that is the starting point of all the analyses, all the investigations that science and philosophy conducts. And in that relation, I would think that this mathematical God would see no forms at all. It would just see a pure flux of variables. without any beings appearing, without any cuts being drawn, because everything is equivalent, everything is indifferent in a way.
Yeah, what's interesting that apparently the god of ancient Greeks with its ancient Greek mathematics would see life. I don't know whether this says anything, but I found this. So is God a mathematician? It depends on what kind of mathematics you're talking about, I guess. But that's neither here nor there. So
I think my internet is working, so if you allow me to finish my thought. I mean, I'm not sure where I interrupt when I was interrupted at the very beginning, or all right. Yeah, so I was trying to say that I very much agree with Jan on the points that like life itself is not truly autopoietic in any. I mean, it's in a rigorous sense. Like it's not an infinitely self-sustaining system. It has like a points of vulnerability. It has like there are situations where it cannot respond adaptively to the environment, and of course it terminates in the point of death always. So it's not really like it's not a mathematically definable autopoietic system, right? So in this sense, I think any sort of argument that tries to differentiate between living and non-living, which goes along the sense of, I think if I understood you correctly, Sebastian, like in the sense that okay, but self-regulatory systems are not truly autopoietic. They don't they require maintenance. They require somebody to build them up. But this also holds for living beings. Like for humans, we're not self-created. We're born, right? We're brought up. We're part of a larger system that is essential to our survival. In this sense, I think that even we ourselves are not truly autopoietic in this sense, I think. So this would be one issue. But I also wanted to point out that the thing that the thing that at least personally I see the biggest issue with defining life as a kind of self-sustaining form is the fact that it evolves. Like it's not a stable form. And I don't think that Jonas is pointing in this direction, but this is something that you could argue against any sort of self-sustaining mechanism, that it's a form that kind of emerges out of something that is not formed by itself. I'm not sure whether, I mean, this is also something that I found kind of off-putting in Jonas's approach, where he tries to define the form of the living beings as a sort of too tightly, like I don't know what the right expression would be, too like it doesn't really allow for you to think about emergence of this form from something that is not already this specific autonomous form. Am I being clear, or this it doesn't really account for this step that goes from non-living to living, like how life emerges. Like this is some sort of, but this would also be I think a powerful argument against any sort of naive mechanicism, right? Because it also cannot account for this, and this I think was kind of a point of the previous chapter. So this is also something that I was thinking about.
Yeah, just a very brief comment here. I think that one of the potential problems is that if Jonas is being read too strongly through the lens of Motorana and Varela's autopoiesis, I think that we are not necessarily doing justice to him. So I think that we are kind of already presupposing that his understanding of need and freedom and everything that he's trying to develop, it kind of, is can be somehow mapped one-on-one to autopoiesis. And I don't think this is the case. So again, if I'm trying to be charitable to Jonas and his reading, his emphasis on transcendence and the in a certain sense form being somehow above materiality provides precisely for this developmental aspect, because in order for it to be form, it has to constantly change. So in its very nature, in its roots, it has to change. there's no other identity for the living being. The only way to stay the same is by constantly changing. So it's form. I mean, we can think about this form in a static manner, but I think that this is the problem of us if we are understanding it this way. Clearly, he's already integrating into this discussion the developments in physics, so the introduction of fields and all of that. So I think that when he's talking about form, he's talking about dynamic forms. So forms that change, forms that are spread out. And I think that what he's trying to say is that with the living, I guess he's trying to kind of point to a certain form that accounts for certain phenomena that are often presupposed in certain other forms. So it is in these forms that you truly get something like temporality, because for this particular form, there is a certain future, because it matters for it in a way that it will constitute itself. So already this futurity, in my opinion, shows that it's not trying to gain to the same point in just maintaining the same structure over and over. So yeah, my main point here would be that I don't think that we necessarily have to, even though in the famous 2002 paper, Weber and Varela tried to do this. They said, wow, look, Jonas was doing something that we were doing, and there are certain affinities. I wouldn't read these two things necessarily too closely. I mean, it can be productive, but maybe we're also not being fair to Jonas by doing so. So that would be just my comment in this regard.
I just wanted to say, sorry, that we're like putting a lot of emphasis on like this autopoietic and the development part of life. So development in the sense of an individual organism going from a germ cell and developing to an adult organism and keeping some sort of self-regulatory life. But I think, I mean, even in the previous chapter, and I think this is kind of important, that life is like as a process has continued for, I don't know, several, I'm not sure, I'm not going to say the exact number, but more than like the life of a single organism. And it's better to imagine the process of life as a string, as a process that goes back to the first cells, with embodiments coming out of this stream, right? So maybe talking about autopoiesis only as this thing that comes out of it is only part of what life actually is, right? Life is this whole continuation from the very first cell to now. And I don't, okay, that was one part. The other part was that I just found really resonating or interesting, something that you, Sebastian, said like 20 minutes ago. And I'm not sure how you phrased it, but it was about how life as a form is different from physical forms, in the sense that it's a form that has itself as a goal or something like that. I'm not like it was in connection with structure of behavior. And then the other question that I might have is, when we were trying to kind of differentiate between like self-producing robots and life, this question of this fundamental caring, I think somebody used this phrase. So what would this fundamental caring be that life has, but something like a robot wouldn't have? And even you can imagine like these self-regulating robots as like being the beginning of a chain that goes into similarly as life many years into the future.
I would say, with regards to the last question, that care in the Heideggerian sense is like a definitive, determinative feature of aliveness, of course, this is now different from Heidegger. So in the sense of it's not an add-on, it's not something that you can add on to a certain something. It is integrative in the sense of that it is that which insists a certain conditions to be met in order to be able to speak of life at all. Let me give you an example. You can have a robot that you can program to kind of do the stuff so that it doesn't break apart or what have you. I don't know how you have a robot that somehow exhibits some sort of a care, and then you unplug it, okay, and then you plug it in, and it can manifest the same behavior the same way. So it is an addition, because the being of the robot is not determined by this particular feature, you know. So the being, the existence of the robot, its parts and what constitute it as a being does not have included in it this care, because it can really have this type of pause. Now it can behave in a way where it can give off the impression as if it cares, but if you turn it off and you plug it in again, it will be the same robot in a certain sense. However, if a living being is put on pause, it's game over. It's game over. And I'm not talking
people in the coma.
They are still physiologically doing the same. They're still either breathing or what have you. So they have to be. So, okay, unplug them and plug them in back again. Okay? I mean, you basically gave a counterexample to what you were trying to kind of argue for here. So that's precisely it. We have to have them plugged in constantly. There is no possibility for them.
Clinical death. What about clinical death?
Yeah, but like they're not exhibiting care. They're when the person is in a coma,
okay,
you might classify him as a living being, but you wouldn't classify him as a Heideggerian Dasein.
True. So, okay, this is a different question. This is a question of whether the care, the term care that Jonas is trying to take away from the Heideggerian framework and introduce it into the level of life is the appropriate one. Maybe we can disagree on that. Okay, but I'm trying to follow how he's understanding it. And for him, for example, the person in a coma would still exhibit vital care. Okay, in this particular sense. In the sense
what about someone who's clinically dead, like Jan said? You're actually dead for a couple seconds, and then you get CPR, and you're alive again, and you exhibit care again. But in the in-between, it was impossible for you to exhibit care.
But okay.
I mean, you're talking about clinical death, again, like from the brain point of view, but obviously all of your cells and organs didn't just like die, you know, like if that would happen, you wouldn't be able to come back to life. So I think there are several levels of this caring of your own body, and like this sort of conscious awareness caring of like our actual everyday experience is just like really one aspect, at least as far as I understood Jonas. Jonas is probably talking also about certain caring of like constituents of like our cells or our bodies, like cells and I don't know what.
So first of all, the notion of clinical death is, in a certain sense, as these things always are, an arbitrary definition to a certain degree, in the sense of that you have a certain line that you have to draw for very different reasons, many of them also very bureaucratic in nature. So the crucial point here being is, so the Jonas would turn this around. He would say, it is not the clinical death that determines whether the organism is alive or dead, but whether the organism is alive or dead is the one that determines the concept of clinical death. Now, whether you can quantify it or not is a different question. You probably could if you had, or maybe you couldn't. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that what Ella was, the argument that Ella was putting forward is going in the right direction. So you might have certain criteria where you say, you know, for all practical purposes, this person is dead, but then we maybe provide certain techniques and we bring that person alive, back to life, but we've just brought it back alive given the specific definition that we were using for practical purposes. There is a certain level, however, where you cannot do this anymore. With robot, you can switch it off for 1 week or 1 year. You can put it into the shed, forget
But
about it.
also, this is a very like old conception of a robot, isn't it? I mean, like a true self-regulatory robot would be one which would reproduce itself, I guess, and be able some sort of self-organization. And if you would, like, maybe that would be a definition of life, then, that if you would plug it off, it wouldn't come back on, right? It wouldn't by itself. But
then
it would.
Then you might probably have a good argument that you've created artificial life. So I don't have issues with that, but I'm trying to draw a differentiation between how life is conceptualized. So in relation to what we do have, the robot that you've portrayed is a science fiction robot. Maybe it will come, maybe it will be, I mean, given what's happening, I am the last person to say that this is not possible or something like that. But what I'm trying to say is that maybe then one could make a good case that this is then, you know, this is the step, the qualitative shift has happened in the robotics where you really have the glimmers of artificial life.
I'd like to add maybe 2 careful comments to this. One is to just circle back to Sebastian, your notion of transcendence and its role in all of this. Yeah, so I feel like transcendence has something to do with this definition of life here. So how from the start it's permeated with this movement of transcendence. And reading this paper made me also rethink this word a bit, because after studying, you know, Merleau-Ponty and literature for years, I kind of became numb to this word transcendence, and it just started to mean what is beyond me and what enters into me from beyond. But it seems to have this deeper dimension, almost a deeply existential dimension to it. And that I feel like when Hans Jonas says that life is run through with transcendence, he means that there is really a special kind of a part-whole relation at play between life and being, capital B, that generates these forms. I'm not sure if I'm reading too much into it, but I felt like there's some kind of a deeply existential connection with the totality that is formative to life, which he's trying to express in this. So that's one comment. And a second small comment is that, so we are talking about the form of life being this dynamic structure, a dynamic pattern that's relatively independent of its matter. I just want to nuance that a bit in saying that it's an organization of static and dynamic forms, where maybe something dynamic has more power than in the rest of nature. But for example, in the cell also, the DNA remains relatively static, while around it, a lot of it is dynamic. So I feel like maybe we shouldn't make it too black and white and say life is a dynamic form. It's an organization of relatively more powerful dynamic forms. Something like that is where my thoughts are going.
Yeah, I mean, with regards to transcendence, I can say a few words, and then I would like to pass on the ball to Jan, actually. So I don't think you've read too much into it. I think that you've read it in an appropriate sense, but I think that the mistake that could be there, or the wrong understanding of transcendence is, usually when people think of transcendence, they think of a certain something that is transcendent. But the thing is that transcendence also designates the act of going beyond. So the beyond going. And in a certain sense, what Jonas is saying, and this is basically a common feature of all the authors that we're doing, is that life as such is transcendent in the sense of it is always above and out of where it is currently. So, you know, you see a certain static snapshot of life. Life already has to be elsewhere, in front of itself. As Plessner puts it, he says that, you know, this is precisely what characterizes the living membrane. So that the when it is a part of a living being, the living form will always be above and within that particular membrane. So it is above because there's always a certain something that is lacking. So you're projected at that. And there is a certain something that you're trying to maintain, which is behind it. So, you know, you don't necessarily have to buy this particular articulation, but this is what is meant by transcendence. This ongoing polarity in the sense of always being beyond of what is given to you now in a snapshot. So by being alive, you're always kind of transcending in this particular manner. You are already in the act of going beyond. Not in the sense of that there is a certain something transcendent, but transcendence as the act of going in a certain sense. And now passing all ball to Jan. Jan, so given that you so far have been kind of a bit more on the skeptical and critical side, so how do you see this relationship that I was talking about in relation to Jonas, the distinction that Merleau-Ponty makes between the physical form and the vital form? So how do you understand it, and how do you position yourself with regards to this?
Well, thanks for the question, but this is very difficult now for me because I'm reading the second year, or I'm working on a paper about the second year of the lectures on nature, where he's dealing with embryology. And then the position is, I think, different than in the structure of behavior. And so I have all sorts of ideas about that, but it's very complicated. It's very complicated. Hard to put it simply, but there is maybe one point of entry that I can use. I was very much intrigued by this section 6 in the essay in this chapter, and that's where he's talking about his distinguishing form and matter, and there's this interesting note number 13 where he is contrasting organism and metabolism and the machine. And I still feel that, from my Merleau-Pontian perspective, I feel that he's articulating the relationship between matter and form too strictly, at least for my standards. So because I know it was interesting that how you, Sebastian, explains that actually what he has in mind is a dynamic form, right? So it's not about a static form that is just exchanging all the materials, but it's remaining all the same. But still, I was really kind of constantly bumping into emphasis and underlinings of exactly this point. So the form is being maintained, whereas the materials are exchanged, right? And he's constantly coming to this point. And I didn't that much see the point that you made, that the form actually is kind of dynamic itself. And I didn't see it there. Maybe I just read too much superficial way, but in this section number 6, I didn't see this. You know, I only saw a very sharp and stark opposition between form and matter. And here is where I have a problem, especially as I read it from a Merleau-Ponty perspective, because this wouldn't be true for Merleau-Ponty, right? He wouldn't put it like that. So the form would really remain open to materials, or it would remain bound to the materials. So we couldn't distinguish it that sharply. So Jonas is writing at some point, the form causes the material to be organized, or something like that, right? I'm paraphrasing. So here, the form is kind of the cause of how the materials are being grouped and regrouped. This means that the materials themselves, as individual in their specificity, have nothing to do with the form. So there is no kind of bottom-up dynamics there. And this is something I think very problematic, and it will be, I think, linked to the problem of interiority, or this kind of too much emphasis on the self maintenance or self care or whatever, you know. And I, you know, this is just a bunch of stuff. It's all complicated, but I see an issue there at the beginning where he is too much sharply distinguishing form and matter. That's how I just trying to get into it. But
can I maybe add some comments to that? So you say, like, you know, he says, he draws the sharp distinction between form and matter, says that form, somewhat to paraphrase, that it causes the matter. I guess at one point he writes that when he's sketching the opposite, the mechanical perspective, that metabolism, that the organism is a function of metabolism and not the other way. But so what he wants to argue is the other way, that metabolism is a function of the organism, right? So that the organism is somehow governing the local metabolic processes, so that the form is causing the local things. This reminds me also of Merleau-Ponty in Visible and Invisible, where he describes a depth perception, and that we get the feeling that we explain depth by reference to the distance between the eyes and how it, you know, how it breaks the light, etc. But he says that in fact it's more like that our access to depth has conditioned the growth of the eyes in this way, that the conditions the conditions in this case, so that the result becomes the origin of the parts that make it. So maybe they're sketching it in this extreme way because it's hard to really get at what we're seeing here. So maybe I get the feeling that maybe they're sketching it in this kind of extreme way where form is governing matter, only to bring out a certain point of a different dynamic that's happening here in nature from what we're used to from the mechanical perspective, where wholes are built up by parts.
Absolutely, that's true. Of course, he's or maybe Merleau-Ponty as well, they are speaking against the materialistic reduction, right? So I understand, but still, like, this is not the end of the story. So okay, the form goes first, but at some point we will have to say, okay, but it doesn't go absolutely first. It actually is kind of formed by the materials, because it's never independent of them. That's exactly the point, because the form is never outside of the materials. Then eventually the materials will actually have something to say to the form, right? And that's a huge problem. I think philosophically, this is the whole architecture, the whole construction will fall down, will be disintegrated. At least this is where I think Merleau-Ponty goes in the end. And then there is kind of reciprocity between the form and matter, and then there is no meaning of speaking of form and matter. There have to be some other notion, and then maybe he will call this the chair, the flesh, right? And then we can go on. But anyway, yeah, I just wanted to kind of maybe bring our attention back to the moment where he is driving or he's introducing the distinction, and I read it as a too strict. But of course, as you're right, that there is a reason to put it like that, of course, because we have to fight the materialism first. Absolutely. Sebastian, did I react to your question? Or Timothy?
Yes, thank you. But I would like to, maybe circle back to Sebastian's or Tul's question of transcendence, and where I see, like, on some points, like, Jonas was very interesting. Like, he makes some new connections in my mind with regards to transcendence and, let's say, this the form of the living. So where he says that like the memory is basically like the most fundamental aspect, cognitive aspect of such self-maintaining wholes or self-interested wholes. And I kind of, and here you can correct me if I totally where if my understanding is too simplified, but I understood as a kind of, you know, of what memory foam is. Like you have a like what's the thing you make out of memory foam? Anyway, you have memory foam,
Pillow.
and you press upon it, and it has a memory in scare quotes, in the sense that it will return to this original shape, right? And so you can think about it like self-sustaining form, like where it's perturbed, like it has some sort of, it needs some sort of memory, implicit memory, to know how to return to the original state, like reform itself, like self-regulate itself in a sense. And this original temporality is something that's somehow connected to the outside, in the sense that it has to predict what it has to do. So the memory is like the temporal dimension then goes like flips outward in a sense. In a sense, it's a process of going back in time, in the sense of having a memory of what you're supposed to look like, be like, and then this flips in the future dimension, where it concerns like how you interact with the environment, how you would achieve this sort of circling back to yourself in a sense. Okay, so that would be just one comment. But then my issue with Jonas, my like say fundamental issue with his understanding of transcendence, is that I think that this isn't quite enough, and this is also connected to his like notion of teleology. Like, is teleology, and here this would be a question to all of you, whether you understand theology in this sense. But I find it like, this is my most like, Sebastian says that he's never truly satisfied with this book. Like, this is my point of contention, like that the living being should not be enclosed in the concept of teleology in this sense, like always turning back upon itself, always being interesting just in its own material structure. Like what, let's say, also what Ela says, like said, like this, the organism being defined as something that takes itself as its own fundamental goal. So in this sense, you have some sort of transcendence, but it's a very limited kind of transcendence. It's the transcendence of predicting what's going on around you, so you can maintain some sort of internal parameters fixed. And this is why I would say that this notion of form is too static for me. Like, obviously, I think it's obvious. So to me, that at least a human form of life, or you could argue other forms, are fundamentally not interested only in maintaining their own essential structures. And maybe in some instances, they may be interested in other things more than their own survival or self-maintenance, right? So how does this process emerge? Like how the forms reshape the very parameters with which they define themselves as forms. Like, this is something that I find missing from Jonas so far, maybe, but his notion of teleology points in this direction, that there's always a kind of closed self-reference in this sense, that teleology is a kind of predefined goal taken as yourself. So yeah, that would be like a long kind of comment.
Okay, but if we take on board what Ela said, and I'm actually very much sympathetic to that if you think about life, you should think about life as something that is a certain rupture, and then this rupture basically constitutes the primordial movement, which takes on different shapes. This is a very intriguing and interesting idea to me. And then if you look on teleology from this perspective, it becomes way more interesting, because then it is, but this you're not going to like, Timmy, because it's going to be potentially politically very problematic, because then it's not about the individual that is the crucial, but it is going to be the life that matters, and it is going to be turned on itself in a way where it will try to preserve itself in different ways and in different transformations and different transmodifications, and it can be very much transcendent. But then I think that you end up with a position that will be very much something not particularly nice, that you will not want to subscribe to. But I think that it is a more appropriate way of looking at this. I'm not saying that this is necessarily a Jonasian view. I'm saying that, you know, this way of having teleology brings this element into the picture. And let me just say something, and then it would be really nice to hear maybe from others who haven't said anything yet. Look at this then from this perspective. What you have then is a lot of experimenting with different forms, which basically provides the capacity to maintain life. And at a certain level, the way this is done is by basically literally constructing as much forms as possible, and many of them die off and just, go extinct. And then another qualitative shift happens, and I know that many of you don't like this term, but when the mindedness enters the picture, this is very interesting, because life then does something very intriguing. It is capable of producing forms virtually, no longer materially, in the sense of that you can produce and create a vast variety of different forms of life without having to kill all of them immediately. Of course, this also happens, but you can virtually toy around with different possibilities where you don't really have to produce the form and kill it all. So if you have life that is extended in this way and teleology understood in this way, you get something very Schellingian speculative, I admit, but it's also potentially very philosophically intriguing. So yeah, those are some thoughts on this matter, and then I suggest we move on to other people chiming in.
I would just say on that's a really fascinating point, and that's basically one way of fleshing out the environment versus world distinction, in the sense that the world arises when there is such a thing as mindedness, and from this perspective, the world is essentially a kind of a virtual testing ground for possible selves, essentially. So it really fits together really neatly, at least in my view, with the environment versus world thing. Just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I would agree that's related to that.
I just wanted to say, it's a question maybe for Timothy, because you keep on stressing this that life is not static, but it can specify its own conditions and goals, and so it doesn't just return to some sort of static parameters, but is this really a question of life or of higher mindedness and things like that? Because if you say okay, so Jonas doesn't introduce this, and then you argument with the example of human beings are not merely life in this way. You're muted, but I'm still not sure if you're trying to say that an amoeba or a cell can also redefine its goals and that it's inherent in life. Otherwise, I think it's kind of nonsensical to try to explain this sort of ability only with reference to autopoiesis or life or whatnot. I think there are so many other aspects, sociality being one among them, that have to be applied if you want to actually understand these sort of complex abilities.
All right, so some quick remarks to Ela. But first of all, yes, I would like to avoid this separation between life and mindedness. I actually endorse some sort of continuity in this sense. It's I think a valuable insight how being alive and some sort of self-interestedness that comes with it determines how cognition operates. And I think it's convincing, at least on the level of, let's say, very simple organisms. I think, we could go into that. That's a whole other complex topic of taking concrete examples of living beings and seeing what kind of functions and capabilities they exhibit. But anyway, let's just take human beings, for example. So I think that what I would like to, I I think that Jonas is right that life is somehow not only, I mean, it's not a trivial, it's not just the fact that we're alive and we're now interested in this specific feature of our existence, that we are alive. It's a very important feature in the sense that it has some bearing on our very cognition, our mindedness in general sense, right? So, but also like, so what I was thinking like is, okay, so you need some sort of central parameter on which you ground your basic goals, let's say, or some sort of, let's say, self-regulatory dynamics which specify what kind of identity you want to let's say want to project into the world, or like want to enact, let's say. And this identity doesn't have to be a very like strictly organismic. It can be like a sort of more personal or like or even abstract kind of identity. You could like identify more with your, like, say, social group or like a nation or something more than you would identify with yourself as a kind of individual being. But you are positioning yourself in the sense that you are trying to preserve some sort of whole, some sort of self-regulatory system. But then the question, so in this sense, you could also like explain a lot of or account for a lot of cognitive features that we exhibit with respect to this sort of fundamental goal of maintaining some sort of structure. But then the question arises how, like, it's obvious that people, at least human beings, are able to shift their central parameters of what kind of being they are trying to enact, right? They're not just statically enclosed in some sort of predefined identity. And this is my point, my problem. Like, I would like to keep some insights from activism and Jonas and people like that who I think make convincing claims about like cognition not being some sort of processing of information without any sort of defining end or structure, like that. There has to be some sort of grounding in a kind of let's say I mean that's not just a representation, it's more of a kind of interacting with the world with some specific goal in mind, right? But then that goal, like how to understand that goal being also dynamically able to shift. That was my basic point.
Yeah, and my point was not that, like, let's go full on into mental representations and discard an activism, like as an explaining concept of certain parts of cognition. But if you want to address this ability of being able to change them, then I think drawing exclusively only on life will not be enough. You don't have the conceptual resources to explain this ability to change. And I don't understand if you want to do this or not, but
just a very quick round. But I think that this would pertain also to notions of ontogenesis, of individual growth, right? So where you have some sort of like cell differentiation, like there's a metabolism. The metabolism of an infant is trying to preserve a different identity than the metabolism of a grown human being, human person. And in this sense, the process of development of the individual has to be able to shift somehow the very order parameters of this system. So in this sense, I think that it pertains to life very much. But also you could, of course, question whether this pertains also to, like, say, bacteria or living cells. I don't know. I don't have any like worked out views on that. But I think that it is a fundamental feature of life, not only of human beings.
Okay, I think that this is something that we will be returning to often, the question of life and mind, and where we stand on this. And it's an definitely interesting one. But yeah, if anybody had any other maybe things that they found interesting and they would like to address, maybe do a little bit of a shift so that we don't get just caught up into a certain something.
Well, I don't know if this keeps us in a circle, but it's still a bit linked with this theme, but maybe it goes back a bit to teleology. Just a small comment. I thought it was interesting that at the end of the essays, Hans Jonas says that the question of the relationship between this finality of life and its more physical, material, mechanical makeup is a very complex, difficult question that we should engage with. So basically he's saying there's no clear answer to how these two levels of causation are related to each other, and that it's an open and very difficult philosophical question to tackle.
Jan, does this somehow pertain to some of the things that you were...
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a good observation.
I don't know, with regards to this particular question or issue that you brought up, Jan, I think that basically, in a certain sense, Jonas is almost like finding himself in a bit of a bind, because, and it's a very common issue with people who end up trying to articulate something like he's doing. And whenever you read authors like this, you always have the impression that they're either undershoot or overshoot. So, you know, they kind of go into a certain direction and position themselves away from a certain something, and then they also have to position themselves from something else, and then they're trying to find the middle ground, and usually it's quite difficult because also the tools, conceptual tools and what have you that you're operating with can be problematic. And with Jonas, I often had this impression, so that there is a certain tension present, and it is related very much to what you were saying, namely this, on the one hand, this tendency to emphasize this distinction. And I think that, you know, the charitable or reading would go along the lines of what Atul was saying, so that basically you're trying to make a point, but then in your wordings, your wordings in a certain sense create your own sphere, and they can start causing problems for you when you're trying to develop your ideas, because you kind of articulated it in a certain sense, and then if you're not super careful, you know, you kind of remain there. I did have impression, though, however, that like his overall tendency, that the intention that he was having was going in the direction where, you know, this form, because it is so dependent on matter to basically retain itself as form, and because this is something that is fundamentally a flux, it is impossible for it to be a pristine form. It is more akin to what you might say a dynamic gestalt. I'm using this intentionally because, you know, gestalt as a form that is given only in and through materiality. It is impossible not to be given in and through materiality. And if this is the case, it is impossible for it not to be influenced by the materiality. So in this regard, you know, if you think about the emphasis on metabolism and what it is, I get the impression that this was the direction he was heading towards. However, he was also trying to constantly underscore this importance and significance of form, and very often he would put it in the first place. So there's just like this tension that seems to be there, and I'm not really sure that he managed to satisfactorily solve it. And I think that maybe that's one of the reasons why the central concept of how he tried to solve the problems, so how he tried to bring all the threads together, was through the notion of teleology. A differently understood teleology, admittedly, but still teleology. This for him was something that he felt was able to do justice to all of this. Now, I don't think that this is the case. I don't think that this is the case. So, you know, the facial things that you're doing are completely justified. But I'm trying to understand, you know, I'm trying to understand, Jonas, why it was that he ended up where he ended up, and why he was trying to do it from this particular angle. So what was it that kind of nudged him in this direction to see this? So yeah,
it's a very nice apology for Jonas, and I have to underscore myself. I like reading him. I like him. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. So I don't want to criticize. I'm enjoying this, but I'm trying also to kind of think one step forward. But yeah. But so I agree with what you're saying. Absolutely, it's all true. If you say teleology, right? If this is the solution. For me, this is still the same problem, because if you have to allow room for the materials to intervene in the form, then you will have teleology, which is just kind of compromised teleology, right? So it's not a teleology; it's kind of directedness. But but I don't see that far. I haven't read the rest of the book, so but we will see. For me, the teleology is not a solution because it's a compromised one.
Yeah, I agree with that. So one of the biggest questions for me is particularly what the heck happens with the notion of causality in all of these accounts? So let's say we take on board Merleau-Ponty and we take him seriously. I mean, in a certain sense, even Jonas is more compatible with certain scientific approaches in the more, let's say, traditional sense of the term than Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty, I don't know that he has a room for causality in any of the classical terms. So yeah, so this is one of the big ones for me. It's not just teleology, even more importantly, and that's why I'm really it's a pity that Dan is not here, because this is like a topic that I would really like to discuss with him. He's very much into defending a naturalist position. I'm not. And one of the reasons is precisely this. I don't think that you can just toy around with all of these different frameworks and have causal structure. I don't think you can do this. And it's not a trivial question. What the heck happens with the cause in these types of approaches? And I don't know to what degree you can stretch the notion of naturalism where you can still say I'm a naturalist, but I don't really care about the cause and effect structure. If you don't have that, I don't know what you have really as a naturalist. I mean, I believe in nature. Well, Böhme believed in nature. Böhme, the mystic, he was very much into nature. So is that naturalism? I mean, so these are the questions that are really, really interesting to me. And the teleology part is not that difficult for people to kind of take apart, because if anything, teleology is trying to find a crack where it could kind of come back in. And most people are more than happy to say, no, we're just going to seal this up. You're not coming back in. But causality is everywhere, and then I think that the question emerges that it's basically a symmetric question. Can you have causal efficience once these things change? How the heck is it presupposed that you can have it? So I don't know. And, Timothy knows that every now and again, I'm kind of bringing this topic up. I don't have a good answer to this, but I have a feeling that the notion of cause or causality in certain senses is one of the neurologic points in these types of, let's say, synthesis or what have you, and what happens with it.
Can I just throw some thoughts out there on this question? Like I've thought about exactly this point also earlier today. These are maybe a bit scattered thoughts, and I don't know how coherent they are, but at least this is how I see it right now. So the teleology we are talking about is not a pure teleology. It's, I think in the last session, we referred to it as a heavy finality, right? So a heavy teleology. It's somehow weighted, it's materialized. And as Sebastian also points out, it has to do with Gestalt structure. So it's a form that's only given in the matter. So to me, that refers back to lived experience, right? So this heavy finality, this teleology that's being discussed here, is the teleology that structures the gestalts of our experience. So it's the form immanent in the sensible configuration. It's how the sensible itself speaks of its meaning to us. So that's where we should localize this teleology. It's not in some abstract physical realm. It's in the architectonic of the life world. And so then the question is, how is this linked to efficient causality? My first thought is that efficient causality is so there's this relation of Fundierung between the two, where at the base we have this perceptual logic, this heavy finality of life recognizing life, life recognizing nature, and then science refines that and starts to use this carnal teleology to articulate a more fine-grained conception of the causal process, and comes up with this idea of efficient causality that has nothing to do with us, that's operative in nature mechanically, but it always refers back to this initial contact that we have. And so I would see efficient causality as a sort of a founded abstraction of the initial contact, which is more teleologically driven, which is driven through this carnal teleology. But these are some wild thoughts of how I link these things together right now.
And the thing is, I personally would this would resonate pretty well with me. But now think about 90% of an activist. It literally demolishes the whole thing that you're trying to do, because that would mean that some form of teleology is ontologically more primary than the causa efficiens, and a causa efficiens is in a certain sense a construct that is somehow developed within this framework, and those people are not going to buy this. You know, they'll say, oh, okay, this is I'm not sure that Jan would buy it. So
well, I was thinking, I'm not sure that I understood correctly the idea, but I think that you kind of put primary the experiential whole, and then, you know, the wholes, you use the vocabulary, and I felt like, okay, this is sensible, a life world. Well, these can be transcendental structures, you know, as a kind of something in the experience. And then, if I understood correctly, you built the causal relationships into those kind of experiential relationships, which I think is just transcendental idealism. So I would definitely I wouldn't go for that. And, you know, Merleau-Ponty can be kind of source for what you're saying, but I don't go for that reading. And I think it's interesting in also to Jonas has this notion to distinguish the epistemological level and ontological level. I think why Jonas is interesting is because he's also working on the ontological level. You know, so it's not about how we experience the wholes, and he's emphasizing this constantly, and he's talking about the ontological individual, like the organism is an example of an ontological individual, and that's interesting. So he's kind of speaking realistically or ontologically about something that exists for real. It's not just, you know, a perception of. And then he connects it with life can be only experienced by life. So it's getting more complicated. But in the first step, he is kind of speaking realistically. So, you know, by what you said, you kind of deleted this issue. You resolved it kind of too quickly for my taste. But
yeah, I think in my formulation, I might have taken it too far into this idealist direction. But I definitely don't see it. I see it more in a I'm at least trying to see it more in a non-dual way, in the way that Merleau-Ponty describes the flesh, where form and matter are entangled with each other. But it's hard to really put into words then how causation links to it. So I'm definitely struggling with the conception too.
Okay, one final comment here. So, because I think it's maybe getting a bit technical, but in the visible and invisible, Merleau-Ponty uses a lot of terms for his ontology. So ontology of the flesh is the one that's become most known, but he's also talking about ontology of the horizon, or horizontal ontology, and he's talking about Lebenswelt ontology. So in several places he uses Lebenswelt ontology. And, you know, you can talk about something being real, and I don't know from which position Jonas is talking because it's not that clear. But for example, Plessner is going to talk about certain things in a way that is the discourse can be ontological, but he's talking in of a Lebenswelt ontology. Yeah, and this doesn't necessarily just mean me being experiential, but just saying that, you know, in a certain sense, the intuitive categories have a certain potential grounding. Now, of course, then this opens a whole lot of questions. But what I'm trying to say is that I wouldn't necessarily say that this has to translate into transcendental idealism. That's one thing. The second thing is that even if you talk about something as real, this still doesn't necessarily say what the meta-ontological framework is within which you're talking about. Because real pertaining to what? You know, for example, to give an extreme example, Berkeley is going to talk about things as real, but for him, that has a very, very specific meaning. So I'm not trying to deflect the question. I'm just trying to say that you can use the ontological discourse, but you don't necessarily have to have in mind something that would count as realist in contemporary understanding. But yeah. Should we maybe wrap this up at this point? Is that we've had 2 hours of solid grounding and pounding, and we still have to have a short meeting. Yeah. Okay, then let's stop here, Adnan, if that's okay, and we'll be seeing each other in 2 weeks.